audiences, like, let's be honest, like, audiences love musicals. They love them. I sometimes it's even as simple as remembering, like, one time I played a Bruckner symphony. Like, I don't remember which one, but I mean, they're pretty much all the same. And I looked at about 45 minutes into this symphony. That's like about halfway through. And like, at least the rows that I could see, like 90% of the people had their eyes closed, and they could have been listening. They could have been listening with their eyes closed. But I was like, man, like, I want to be asleep with you guys.
I had a great time chatting with today's guest, who happens to be one of the Contrabass Conversations team members. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Krista Kopper, who has been cataloging and archiving all the things we talk about on the podcast, which is a monumental task. You would not believe how much you go through almost 600 episodes here, how much there is to do. So thank you to Krista for that. But the reason we're chatting today is because Krista has recently launched a podcast called the Backstage Creative. And this podcast focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater, which is where Krista works. She works as a theater musician. So behind the scenes of theater to create the scenes, the music, the costumes, the props, everything that goes into live productions. So we talk about Krista and her background, starting a podcast, and the benefits that come from tackling a project like this that's very near and dear to my heart, obviously, since I've been jamming on this podcast for 12 years now. And definitely check out her podcast. We've got a link in the show notes, or just search for the Backstage Creative in whatever app you're using to listen to this. Quick shout out to our sponsors, D'Addario Strings, Colstein Music, Upton Bass, The Bass Violin Shop, Steve Swan String Bass, and a new sponsor for the next month, Texas Hill Country Bass Collective. More on all of them in a bit, but we're going to start off actually with Krista playing an excerpt from the Gubaidulina Sonata for bass and piano.
Hey!
How are you doing, Krista?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. How is it in the Twin Cities right now? Is it frigid, or is it okay? Or
so actually, are you looking at my Facebook?
Yeah.
So I haven't updated that. So I'm not in the Twin Cities anymore. I'm actually in New Hampshire right now.
I was confused because I was seeing stuff about New Hampshire, but then I was seeing stuff. Okay, so you're in New Hampshire. Okay, well, how are things in New Hampshire? It could be cold there too?
Yeah, it's kind of like sleeting and snowing right now, so that's not very fun, but I don't have anywhere to go, so it's fine.
I've never been to New Hampshire. My dad's side of the family is like old New England, so I think there's some statue somewhere in New Hampshire of some Heath relative from very long ago, but I've never been myself.
That's funny.
Yeah, that's cool. I think the closest I've ever been is, I haven't even been to Boston. I think I've been to Lenox, where Tanglewood is, and I think that's probably the closest I've ever gotten to that neck of the woods.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I like it because it's just like more sparsely populated compared to like New York and Connecticut. Northern New England there's just more room.
There's a music festival called something like Apple Hill Chamber Music, or Apple Hill
I've
Players.
heard of that.
Yeah, and this really fascinating bassist named Richard Hartshorn Dobbs plays. He's been on the faculty for that for forever. I think he was one of the founders, maybe. But this guy is such a character, and I think he's in Vermont, not New Hampshire, but he's from around there. And his whole thing, I don't know what else he does besides this, but he goes and plays solo Bach at prisons. But then he just did a recital in New York City somewhere with playing all 6 of the Bach cello suites.
Nice.
So he's this beast, but he's this like giant hippie, kind of like exactly what you think of when you think of a Vermont person, like big white beard and just very sort of like drinking his tea, walking around, and
yeah, there's a reason the slogan here is "Live Free or Die." It's very, it's true.
That's cool. How did you end up moving? I know you went to Hart, right? Was that for your master's, or?
Yeah, so I'm from Kansas, and then I did my undergrad at Wichita State, and then I went to Hart for my master's, and then I lived in the Twin Cities for about 2 years, and then last year I moved. I did like a summer repertory season in Colorado, and then I've been in between New Hampshire and Kansas since then playing. So.
Wow. Okay. And so is playing most of what you're doing, like doing theater work and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of a weird, like, oh, here we are. Okay, this is what we're doing now. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but I love it. And so, yeah, I'm mostly doing theater stuff now. So
that's such an interest. So it's such an interesting path, and it's such not a path that's not necessarily prescribed for you in music school. You know what I mean? Like, like a really good friend of mine, Trevor Jones, who actually helps out with the podcast also. Trevor, his main gig, I guess, is playing at the Lincolnshire Marriott, which is this theater just north of Chicago, and they run shows. I mean, every week of the year, I think, and I think he's been the house bassist there for maybe 5 years, maybe 6 years, something like that. But then he also he subs in some of the downtown shows like Hamilton and that kind of thing, and then does a potpourri of other activities. But what's the so we can go a lot of directions, and I want to talk about the podcast and everything, but like. Maybe we can you take me down that path? Like you're studying, were you studying bass at Wichita State?
Yeah, bass performance and ed. Okay,
so bass, and that's a great education school. That's one of those legendary, I don't remember who, there's so many famous people that came out of Wichita State. Jacqueline Dillon?
Yeah.
Didn't she have a connection there? Yeah.
I had a semester with her, and like I caught her right as she was retiring, and I was like, dang it. But she was amazing, just so wise and wise, but also able to really clearly articulate things, like simplify it. Like, she was brilliant. I loved her.
Yeah, no, she was fantastic. She came to Northwestern when I was there and did some sort of music ed session, which I don't remember about it, except I remember I thought she was awesome. So I remember I have like good, and then she did a panel discussion with a bunch of other luminaries in the string teaching world at Aston maybe 10 years ago. And there's another, is it Dave Luttrell? Is that the name? He might be somewhere else, but there are a few other names I know from like the string teaching world that spent time at Wichita State. So music ed and double bass, and now you're living in New England and doing theater, and you got this podcast. So just take me on that path.
Sure. So I'm from a pretty small town in Kansas, like the southwest corner, like close to Colorado and Oklahoma. Lots of farming and cows, and I started on violin, like probably most of the people who listen to this. And, of course, my school didn't have a bass player. And so my teacher was like, hey, like, you're in the music room all the time. Can I teach you bass? And I was like, no, like that instrument looks kind of silly. And like, what is even the purpose of it? And but she kept pestering me because I think she was pretty desperate for a bass player. And so finally I gave in, just, because I respected her. And so I was like, okay, fine, I'll try it. And I hated it. And she's like, no, just try it for another week. And I was like, okay. And then, okay, try it for the next week, And eventually what got me hooked was jazz band. And I think that was because I like being the only person on a part. And so when I was in jazz band, I had some freedom to add fills. And if I messed up, like, it was all on me. Like, I didn't have anyone to kind of have my back. I had to really be on my part and really focused. And so then went through high school, and I was like, well, I don't really know how to do anything else. I guess I'll go to school for music. And at the time I thought, if you go into music, you're going into education, because that's all I saw. Like, there's not professional music happening in the town that I'm from. At least when I was there, it could be different now. But and so then I got there and studied with Mark, who was like, hey, like, you can do different things, and you can, play in clubs for jazz, and you can be in an orchestra, and you can do chamber music. And so that really helped kind of start broaden my horizons. And then I love teaching, but I realized that public school classroom teaching wasn't for me. I think.
I understand.
I liked the teaching part, but it was all the other stuff,
Yeah.
the instrument inventory and meetings at like dark 30, and I was just like, I don't think this is for me. And I was worried because a lot of the music teachers I saw didn't play anymore because they just didn't have time to. And I was like, I love playing so much, and I don't want that to happen to me. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go to grad school. And around this time, about halfway through, I discovered the Tubin Concerto, and the cadenza from that piece is amazing. And I heard that, and I was like, I didn't know that music could be this intense and this wonderful. And so I worked on that piece, and so Mark was like, hey, if you're interested in contemporary music, there's this guy, Robert Black. Why don't you check him out? He teaches, in Connecticut. And so I started watching videos of Robert doing what Robert does, which is and just being so fascinated by this guy. And so I was like, maybe I'll check it out. I was thinking about grad school, and so I went and took a lesson with him and loved it. Also at Wichita State, I started doing more theater stuff, mostly because I think no one else wanted to do it. I think a lot of times doing theater gigs kind of not all the time, but sometimes it's viewed as kind of a lesser gig or less, like not as high on the totem pole, in terms of art.
Right. Yeah. I think that's instilled in a lot of people. Like, it's that alternate path thing too. It's just like, it's not like the jazz path or the classical path. It's like, it's kind of got elements of both, but it's its own thing. It seems like.
And I discovered that theater gigs pay pretty well compared to like the orchestra stuff I was getting, in the tip jar at like a jazz club. And so I was like, I love, and then I discovered that I loved it. And I was like, hey, like I'm getting paid and I love this. Like, this is great. Like this can be kind of a side thing. So then I went to grad school and studied with Robert and played all sorts of crazy and awesome music and met a lot of people. Like his studio is fun because he attracts a lot of different students and a lot of people who are interested in kind of pursuing a different path. And so it's just the culture, at least when I was there in his studio, was just so creative and inventive, and everyone was working on different things. And studying with him was just phenomenal. Like, I feel like 90% of who I am as a musician is from somehow I can trace it back to Robert. And he just like blew open the doors to like the world and how to perform, like playing a recital, like that's different from performing. Like there's another aspect to performing besides just getting up and playing your instrument. And then, so after grad school, I was like, well, I like playing. I didn't really like the East Coast. Like I was just driving a lot, like driving to a lot of different gigs. Like there's work up here, which is great. But you're in the car all the time. And I was like, I don't know if I really want that life. New York City's great, but I don't think that's a good fit for my personality. And so I took a job teaching adjunct at a small school in north of St. Paul, Minnesota. And so moved there for 2 years and tried to get into the music scene there, but it didn't quite work out how I wanted. Like there's a lot of music going on there, but a lot of it is like kind of amateur or member supported ensembles or, and I love to play and I'm not just in it for the money, but I want to get paid. Like,
yeah, of course.
So then I was like, well, and I was a substitute teacher, which is a terrible job. And so just kind of piecing all these things together, and I was like, this isn't the life, this isn't what I want. And so what am I going to do about that? And, I was like, well, I love doing theater, so let's apply for some theater stuff, kind of see if I can get something. So then I got a summer job working at a repertory theater in Colorado, and so went out there for the summer, and then the New Hampshire thing opened up. So then I, a little reluctantly, drove all the way back up to New Hampshire or to New England, and so yeah, here I am, and I love it. I think theater, I like the intensity of it because it can get really stressful and it can get really intense. But especially in the orchestra world, sometimes I didn't always feel like I belonged. I think sometimes as a female bass player, there's, like Megan McDevitt. Mm-hmm. Is that her last name?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, her podcast episode was so great. But yeah, I did come up against a lot of things that she talked about, and trying to lead sections. So I was like, I'm putting a lot of energy into this, and I want to put energy into music making, and not to say that happened with every section, of course, but
right.
Yeah. So the theater thing just kind of I fell in my lap because no one else wanted to do it, and so I'm like, okay, like I'll get paid to do this, and if you want to be in an orchestra, like that's great. You can drive all over the country and do all of that stuff, and I'll work and make money.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much more just lucrative time for money, and I think the theater world can be, at least in my experience, the stuff I've done, or people that I know and have talked with, and then I think the hang up that a lot of people have, if they're thinking, oh, I'm going to play in an orchestra, I'm going to play jazz or what have you, is like, oh, I can't imagine playing the same show 8 times a week, which is true. There is an element, but the only thing, you've done much more of this than I have, obviously, but the only thing I've played like a whole bunch is Forever Plaid. The show was in Chicago 8 years or 7 or 8 years, whatever. The last year I ended up doing at least 3 shows a week. I was the regular sub, and sometimes 5 shows. So nothing like, the 700, 800 that some of them have done, but I think I was pushing 100 or maybe exceeding 100. And I remember at a certain point I was like, wow, I really know this show, but it's just like it's a different skill. It's still the creativity, at least in my experience, was still there. And then like whenever something different happened, the energy of the crowd was different, or we had a sub for one of the 4 plaids or something, or the pianist was different or what have you, that still was there. But I find it a totally creative and extremely interesting area of music, and thriving area of music too.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I think I mean, there's always going to be a part, like this is a job. And so there's always parts of the job that maybe aren't exciting every time. Like I'm not always exciting. Like I just finished up Cabaret. It wasn't my favorite show. So I wasn't always like, yeah, let's play the show again. Cause everyone dies at the end. And so like, you just leave feeling awful about life. But I mean, then I thought, like this is a job, like not every part of a job is going to be great and amazing. And sometimes it's just simply like being like, okay, like opening your eyes and noticing like, okay, how can I play my part better? Like, okay, I'm playing with the trombone here. How can I make my releases exactly the same as him? Or how can I make sure that I'm super in tune? Or how can I, like, there's always something to improve. And to me, it never gets boring. And, you find, or like, I have a really awesome bow. Like, I love my bow. And so it does like 80% of the work for me. And so sometimes it's just appreciating like, okay, I don't want to do this show today, but I get to use my bow, and that's amazing.
I have that feeling myself a lot. I remember I got my really good bow that I have now maybe 12 years ago, and I remember thinking like, wow, I like all of a sudden playing it took on like a new level of fun. And I was also realized like, oh wow, like you said, 80% of the work. It's like, wow, I can almost be like a sloppier player with this awesome bow. No, it's those simple pleasures, and yeah, the whatever job it is in music, outside of music, but within music, there's a certain amount of repetition. You're talking about substituting and teaching and that kind of thing. Right before we got on this call, I kid you not, 5 hours substituting middle school orchestra in San Francisco, which is not a normal thing for me. We don't need the detail. It was like this last minute thing. I was going to be doing bass. I used to teach orchestra, so poof, there I was, the orchestra teacher. Krista, I am beat.
Yeah.
Like, you want to talk about, drudgery and repetition and I mean, they're great kids, but it was, so I would rather have been playing, show and those minutiae and just all the amazing things happening in a pit. It just, I was, about a month ago, I was in Chicago and I sat in the Hamilton pit. Tom Mendel, who's the bassist for that, who you totally should have on your show, by the way. I'm sure he'd love to be in there. And he's the former, head of the theater division of the AFM and just a really interesting guy. He said, next time you're in Chicago, come sit in the pit and check out Hamilton. And And so I was watching like that. And what he does is amazing for that show. You know, he's like on upright, he's on 5-string fretted. I think I'm remembering this right. Then he's on fretless. Then he's even playing keyboard bass for a couple of tracks and pedal boards. And I mean, there are 2 moments in the show where he rests, and that's it. Otherwise it's like constant. And I just like trying to process what's going on there. It's totally fascinating. And I can tell you think so too.
Yeah, I think it's a great environment. I think especially in theater, I mean really anything in the arts, like no one's there because they want to work a 9-to-5 job, or no one's there because they want to be super wealthy. No one's there half-heartedly. You know, I mean, it's not that everyone that I've worked with is great. That's not true. But everyone who's there is passionate about it. And so like that it's usually a really great environment. Audiences, like, let's be honest, like audiences love musicals. They love them. I sometimes it's even as simple as remembering, like one time I played a Bruckner symphony. Like I don't remember which one. But I mean, they're pretty much all the same. And I looked at about 45 minutes into the symphony. That's like about halfway through. And like at least the rows that I could see, like 90% of the people had their eyes closed. And they could have been listening. They could have been listening with their eyes closed. But I was like, man, like I want to be asleep with you guys.
I know that feeling.
So yeah, I think you just have to find something positive. Like you just have to find something good. Like, okay, I'm getting paid at the end of this. Or okay, like, yeah, a lot of it is mindset. Yeah. You know, there are musicians that come in and you can tell that they'd rather, you know, they wanted to do the orchestra thing and it didn't work out, or they'd rather be getting paid to be in a touring jazz combo. And they come in and they do their thing and they leave, and you just miss out on so much if you have that attitude. But if you focus on like how much passion and how much work goes into a theater production, and all of the people that painted the sets and did the costumes, and the sound guy who's back there like fighting, you know, no one is ever happy with the sound and he's back there doing his best, and the stage manager who's there more than anyone else. And it's just, there's so much to be inspired by. And so you just have to open your eyes. Like, who cares if you have to play the same show over and over? Like, you get to work with amazing people.
One thing that has impressed me about Upton Bass ever since I got to know them was how many artists there are out there that are so satisfied with the work that Upton has done for them. Here's Lucia Torino of The Devil Makes Three, outstanding band, on her experiences with Upton.
I have the Upton travel bass. A friend of mine who was in a band called Brown Bird, I think she'd had some work done on her bass, and she had a pickup that she got from Upton, and she knew one of the guys who worked down in the factory in Mystic. Also, calling it a factory is really charming because it's really just a barn that smells amazing with lots of cool basses and very sweet men. Chris Wood, he had 2 Chadwick basses with him, and so I got my courage up and sort of sidled over to him at one point and was like, I need a bass, what should I get? And I talked about Chadwick and about Upton, and he was like, honestly, I'd go with the Upton.
Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. This episode is brought to you by the Texas Hill Country Bass Collective. Join them July 22nd through July 25th for their 6th annual Austin Bass Workshop. Come join friends from the area for 4 days of music, bass, and fun, and work with 2019 featured guest artist and former podcast guest Dennis Whitaker. Learn more at TexasHillCountryBassCollective.com. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. Steve has been active in the bass world and also the guitar world for years. Here's a bit from our live podcast taping with Steve on how he got into that business. Guitars and basses.
Guitars and basses.
Okay, how did that happen?
They're both helper instruments. I've always played the rhythm guitar, quite often with bass lines moving, either in swing style, jazz style, or country style. Bass is the same thing, supporting the band, the group of people you're playing with. So I've always felt like I was a support person.
I love how Steve describes being a support person, and he is certainly that for the bass community here on the West Coast, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. His shop is located just south of San Francisco, and he has a large retail showroom with about 70 basses on display. And these basses are professional top of the line basses. These basses are student level basses and everything in between. They're beautifully set up. So if you're looking for a bass or you know someone who is, be sure to check out Steve at steveswanstringbass.com. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, Steve. Well, and that's like the amazing thing of musical theater or opera or what have you, pulling all those elements together. It really is that like kind of amazing, audacious art form that just has so many moving parts, and it's like a roller coaster ride, even when it's a show that's been, especially leading up to opening night, but even once it's going, I was watching, so this is sort of musical theater, I don't even know what to call this, but to the extreme, I was also sitting in the pit for Cirque du Soleil about only a year ago. God, it seems longer ago than that. But watching Derek Jones playing bass, and they've got the Wheel of Death going, and that theater. It's like you want to talk about insane? It's like literal life and death. And the musicians, the acrobats, or I don't even know what you call Cirque du Soleil people, but those performers they're hitting certain marks based on the music. So like if you play something a little differently, you literally could be it's like as close to life or death as music can be. And wow, that was just such a phenomenal experience. And those Derek Jones has been doing that for 12 years, I think, and he is like as pumped to do that show as probably he was at the beginning. And he talks about how it's evolved over the years, and so you're sitting there doing shows like maybe not but shows like in that world, and you think, I want to start a podcast about this. I want to bring these people out. So what inspired you to start doing that? And I'd love to. I so rarely get to talk to someone else who has a podcast, so I feel like we have so much behind the scenes stuff that we could talk about. So just talk about the spark to start the podcast.
Sure. So it came through this summer, and so the housing situation over for my summer gig was that you didn't live, for the most part, you didn't live with people in your department. So I didn't live with any of the other musicians. I lived with an actress and a costume person and the person who painted the scenic charge, the painter, the box office person. And so we're in the middle of nowhere, Colorado, and so our phones don't work the best. And so then it was great because during meals we had to like talk to each other, and not sit on our phones the whole time. And so my eyes were just open to their jobs. I was like, I didn't even know all of the work that goes into costumes. Holy cow. And like the design process that they go through. And, as musicians, one of the things I like and don't like about doing theater is that we kind of show up very last minute. Mm-hmm. We'll come in and have one, maybe two band rehearsals. We have a Zyex probe, and then it's tech week. So that's like 4 rehearsals, and then we open. So we come in when everything's pretty much ready to go. And so I just loved talking to these people and hearing about their jobs and like how they solved problems and how they, like the person who painted the set, she was talking about, okay, well, this is the lighting design. So I need to match, this color of green to what's going on with the lights. And so I thought, so really, I mean, it's a very similar reason for why you have started Contrabass Conversations that you've mentioned many times is I just wanted to have more cool conversations with people that inspired me. And it was conversations I was already having. And I was like, well, maybe other people would like to hear these as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that was kind of how my initial thought. And then I also wanted a project that pushed me. Like theater parts are, for the most part, are pretty simple. Like you're not going to find too many complicated things. Like you'll have a lick or two here or there, but for the most part, it's fairly not easy. Just simple music. And so I wanted something to kind of push me out of my comfort zone and to make me nervous and to make me a little scared. And so I thought, well, I listen to all these podcasts and I know all these cool people. Why don't I just start a podcast? And so like it was terrifying. Like even now, I think I've released maybe like 7 episodes. Even now, I get really nervous about it, which is good. Like it's good to keep growing and to keep pushing yourself. And so that was a big goal as well, as how can I push myself and keep growing. And pushed back those boundaries of my comfort zone a little bit. And so a podcast was definitely fit that criteria for me.
Oh yeah, it's like the greatest self-improvement project ever if you approach it the right way. And it's still like I find that it's good just for like it's a good thing to kind of push me to keep learning and growing and developing. And like I don't always sit down. In fact, I rarely sit down and is like I love having these conversations, but like when I'm about to do them, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I want to do an interview today and then every time, maybe a couple times, no, but 99% of the time I get done, I'm like, that's the absolute best way I could have spent my time doing that. And I still get, it depends on who it is, but I still get nervous for certain key, like really famous people freak me out, and really famous people I don't know that want to do it over the phone. So like Krista and I right now can see each other. We're doing it over FaceTime. But like Christian McBride's a great example. So like people like Christian McBride, and I love chatting with him, but I was so nervous. And I'm like, Jason, stop being so nervous. I was so annoyed with myself. I was trying to like take deep breaths, but having the personal connection, like even if they're famous, if you like can see them, like in person's great, or even like this. But if you can't see them and they're famous, those are the ones that freak me out. Still, like I have this hilarious Ron Carter kind of yelled at me at the beginning of my interview with him. I don't think I've said this on the podcast, and I have it on tape because my podcast recording software just starts, and I will not release this anytime soon, and maybe never, but I do have Ron just absolutely dressing me down because Ron thought I called him at the wrong time. No, I did not call Ron at the wrong time. That's like I checked my email the moment we got off, but he thought it was the wrong time. So I was already nervous. And then the first thing is he starts yelling at me, and my voice went up really high. And so like I'm like a major third above where I normally act at. So that was like my saddest moment. And then of course it's one of my most popular podcasts because it's Ron flippin' Carter. So I've had lots of growing experiences too, but like what's been surprising for you or challenging or unexpected or anything about the process?
There's a lot of great things that editing can do, but it can't do everything.
Yes. Yeah.
So learning like what editing can and can't do, I think has been kind of the most surprising. I didn't think it would be, I figured it would be difficult, just like you put out an episode about how to do a podcast several years ago. And I've listened to other like how to, people who do podcasts will put out like a how to, and they're like, oh, editing takes a while. And I was like, oh, it's fine. It'll be great. But it takes a long time.
Yeah. And it's tough because like, I wish I could never edit. Like I wish I could put out a podcast and never edit. But the problem is, and I'll bet my guess is you're running into this or is like people who aren't like used to public speaking. To get someone really comfortable, I think offering editing or saying I do edit, and I do it, or I have folks that help edit or whatever. But like offering that up it makes it a really safe space. So you can take chances and sometimes things start a little stilted and they warm up. But oh my goodness, I wish I could. A lot of podcasts I listen to, you probably too, they just never edit. I think offering editing is great. I think if it was with people who are used to being on mic all the time, I think you would almost never have to do it. But yeah, you're right. It takes me twice when I do sit down and edit. It takes me about twice as long to edit as the length of the audio. So like if we have an hour conversation, it takes me 2. I don't know what that's been like for you in terms of timing.
For me, it takes longer, but I'm still figuring it out. I'm still kind of learning, and I'm getting faster. Which is good for my mental health. And eventually you just have to say like, okay, this is rough around the edges. It's not perfect. But like, this is, my 7th episode and it's fine, cause my standard is like listening to your podcast, like how you're almost up to 600. And so of course it's not going to sound as good as Contrabass Conversations or, Entrepreneurial Musician or Don't Keep Your Day Job, because they've been doing it for longer than me. And so I think you just have to start, like you just have to jump in, say, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to push record, and it's going to be a little messy, and there's going to be a lot of ums maybe, or there's going to be sirens going on in the background, and it's fine because the content is good, and the content is the most important part. So if it's a little rough, like, it's okay, it's fine.
It's totally fine. And your episodes I've listened to the last one, the first one, and a few other chunks, and you sound great. You do not sound, it does not sound rough around the edges at all. And I love, by the way, you just shouted out some of my favorite podcasts, the Entrepreneurial Musician, and then Don't Keep Your Day Job, right? That podcast. I love that podcast. What's the host's name? I'm forgetting her name.
Kathy Heller.
Kathy Heller. And Andrew Hitz on the Entrepreneurial Musician actually had Kathy on.
That's how I found out about the podcast. I was like, she sounds great. And then I listened to her podcast. I was like, this is phenomenal.
She's great. No, that's a great one. Editing's tough because you also want people to sound like themselves. Like if you do too much, it can sound like the rhythm's off. And I think I'm not sure if I have any idea what I'm doing in terms of that still, like the rhythm off. My thing these days, sometimes I'll do like a giant chunk of podcasts, and I have a couple people that help with the editing, but if it's like a ton, I'll be like, okay, I'm taking these 3. I'll have Mike take these. I'll have Steve take these. And my new thing, and I don't know if this is good or bad, but this is my new thing, is like I edit the first few minutes a bunch because I want it to start strong. And that's also a lot of the time when it's like the roughest because you're still finding your groove. And then I like try to edit less as it goes if I can. And now I have my iPad. I'm showing Krista my iPad Pro. I have my iPad in front of me. And I have notes I take, and then when I'm talking to someone, I change the color to red, and anything weird that happens in the audio, I just write down that time, or something I know I want to edit. And that has saved me so much time, because now I'm like, okay, I know, and I just go backwards through my numbers, and it's like, boom, 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 there's a siren, we lost the connection, coughing, we're taking care of a cat, this cat will randomly jump up on me, and like, so that sort of stuff, that's helped me with editing a ton.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, that's that. And my new, I have this discipline where like, it doesn't matter who I talk to. I only allow myself 1 page of notes. And because I have taken like 4 or 5 and I find I never get past the first. So, and I kind of like it. So it's like, doesn't matter if it's Christian McBride or I was talking to this, someone who's like a freshman in college, it doesn't matter. It's like everybody gets 1 page. And I've really enjoyed that discipline. How do you prep, or how have you prepped? Like, what's your process like?
Sure. So the people I'm interviewing now are all people that I know and work with. Eventually it'd be nice to like reach out to people that I don't know, but so I use Facebook a lot to see, first of all, like, do I know where they live, and where they're working, and a lot of times people who work behind the scenes do a lot of different things. And so I may know someone as a lighting designer, but they're also a scenic designer. And so seeing, past jobs and different jobs that they've done. And then I think I sit down, I just use like paper and pencil and write down questions that I have, like, how does the design process work? Like when someone asks someone to design the sound, like what are the next steps for that? And so really it's just a lot of my own questions, like, where do you get the sound effects? Yeah. Or how do you, like, for a music director, like, what are some issues that go into hiring people? How do they decide who they hire? And so a lot of it is just my own curiosity of like, how does your job work? And some of the questions I think maybe are a bit silly, at least when I listen back. But as a bass player, musicians have a unique perspective in the theater world because we're performers, but we're also behind the scenes. So we're kind of the bridge between the actor. Well, we're in both worlds, and so I don't always get to see the design process, but that's also kind of the world I'm in because I'm part of that. So it's and as a bass player, like we, even in an orchestra too. We just see more. Yeah. We can see the bigger picture more, usually because we're replaced and, our parts are a little simpler. So, so a lot of it is just being curious. And when I'm in the show, like noticing, when I've done this show like 30 or 40 times, like, okay, I'm noticing the lights. How does that work? Or how does, how do all the different costume changes work, or what's the process of designing for one character and all the different scenes. And so a lot of it is just my own curiosity of paying attention and watching what's going on.
Every violin shop has its own unique origin story, and here's A440's Michael Spadero on how the shop got started.
My mother-in-law started this business in 1982, and she was a professional cellist. But the story she told me was that Camille, my sister-in-law, is violinist with the LA Phil. And when she was maybe in high school, her violin was being repaired in a shop. And for some reason, the shop owner had some legal problem where, like, the Cook County Sheriff or someone confiscated all the stuff.
Okay.
So the only way for my mother-in-law to get her daughter's violin back was to buy all the contents of the shop at a police auction.
Okay.
Wow. So since she had all these instruments, I think that's what initially made her start a shop.
It's a great shop. I've gone there for years, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Michael. And folks, check them out at a440violinshop.com. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They proudly offer the largest variety of fine basses and bows in the Southeast. You can find something at every price point by makers such as Thomas Martin, Bill Lakeberg, Romano Solano, Lemur Music, all Shen models, K, Epiphone, and bows by Louis Morizot, Fuchs, Nürnbergo, Arcos Brazil, and others. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. One thing that D'Addario strings specialist Lyris Hung gets asked a lot is, how can you keep your strings in better playing condition? Here are her thoughts.
I get a lot of this question. People often ask me, I don't want to spend a lot of money. What can I do? And I mean, my answer is unfortunately really, really simple. And that's just to clean your strings, to keep your strings really clean. And a lot of people, moan and with that, because they clean their strings. Most people will clean their strings, but not often enough.
There you go. Simple, huh? Keep that cloth handy and wipe down those strings after each use. Thanks to D'Addario for sponsoring the podcast. There's something about bass and like that macroscopic project thing that I see, whether it's conducting or arranging or you name it. But it's got to be some combination of sitting in the back, seeing the whole thing, laying down the roots and fifths and feeling the foundation, maybe sitting up. You can sort of see, like a lot fewer violinists I see like off on their own projects. Maybe our parts, tend to be, they're not always simple, but they probably tend to be simpler. And yeah, there's something about, I think there's something about just the role that a bassist has in orchestra, certainly musical theater and some other areas that I think there's something there for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
How are you things I think about that I never get to talk with anybody about. So how are you recording your podcasts? Are you doing them all remotely right now, or in person?
It depends. If I can do them in person, I like to do in person better.
Yep.
It's a little easier from editing standpoint, I think, to do them separate. So like if there's a siren on my end, then it's easy to take out. Whereas, if there's a siren and we're both in the same room, it's harder. You got to stop or just leave it in.
Yep.
But yeah, and I'm just recording on my computer. I'm still keeping it pretty simple and cheap.
It's good. That's smart. Yeah.
Yeah. Upright bass stuff is expensive. Like we all know, it's expensive to keep an upright bass in good condition. So that's where most of my money is going right now. So yeah, I'm just recording on my computer. I tried an iPad for a while. I had right now I'm using a Mac. I had an HP for a while, but it just bit the dust. So I'm experimenting, but I like doing a MacBook for now.
Well, it's interesting because it's amazing. You don't need complicated gear to do a good podcast. Boy, if you want to talk about podcast foibles, if you go back into my podcasts were so rocky to start out, and especially the remote ones, because I had this horrible piece of garbage, like Acer laptop, like one of those big gaming laptops with the loud fans and everything. And like you can watch the battery go down. And I had this total garbage software called, I don't even remember what it was called, but it would get my audio out of sync with the other person. Oh, no. So it would, as we went, I think, and it would be that I would get ahead of them, and it baked into one file. So there was no separation. So my first maybe 30 or 40 episodes, if you listen, I tried to edit out as best as I could, but it was really hard. So what would happen is somebody would say something funny, but what would actually happen is they'd be talking and I'd all of a sudden be like, whoa, like over them. And then they'd say their funny thing and it's like dead silence. It's so awkward. So that was it. But you could use, like, I think I used an H2 for a long time for like everything. And then I was just using like my iPhone mic, and not that this was producing the best results, but like that, or I've used my iPad. I've used all kinds of things. And it works great. I finally, when I decided to like just dump a bunch more time into the podcast, I got this Zoom H6, which I love. So I use that for just about everything these days, but it was expensive. It was like $400 or something like that. It was one of those things that I still had a full-time job, and I thought, I'm not going to want to spend this money, in 2 months. So let's just like buy a bunch of gear. But no, that's cool. Okay. I was curious, when you're doing it, what are you doing when you're talking not in person? Do you have a piece of software you're using, or how are you doing that?
I've been using Zencastr.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I don't know. Did you use that for a while? That might have been, I might have heard that from you.
I have never used it for my podcast, but I've used it on other people's podcasts, and it works great. The one thing I've heard people have a problem with is if the other person closes their computer early. Like, you have to stay on Zencastr this may have changed, but at least when I was talking to someone like a year ago, if the other person quit Zencastr, like, you had to wait for like a minute after the call was done, which is not a big deal at all. But, you'd say like, all right, bye. And then they would press click. And I did hear of somebody like losing a file, right, which is scary. Or maybe they were able to call Zencastr and get it back somehow. But the Zencastr audio quality is very good. I think whatever it's doing, it seems to work. And I'm still trying to figure that out. I have no idea what to do in terms of remote. Like, Krista and I are talking on FaceTime right now. I'll use Skype, which all works fine. I've been doing Facebook Messenger video, and I have this screencasting software called ScreenFlow, and I record just our audio, because some people, I don't know, I should probably try other things like Zencastr, but I just haven't. So I was curious. Do you send more nerdy podcast questions? But I never get. Do you send people topics in advance, or what do you do in terms of that before you talk?
If they ask, if they ask, I'll send like kind of generic, like, well, we might start with your background. Usually once you start with people's background, they get kind of warmed up, and then that always leads to an offshoot of another topic. But yeah, I'll send kind of generic questions, and usually we abandon those pretty quickly once we get going on the interview. But
yeah, I've had such a hard time with that, because like those early, again, things not to do. I had this list of 30 questions that I would send everybody, and people would try to do their homework and answer a bunch of them. It never produced great results, and it was a mistake on my part. So like I was taught there's a great, actually, I'm going to have him on the podcast this summer. We're going to chat ISB, but there's a really cool guy named Pierre Bata. He's from Quebec. He's a public speaker. He's got a TEDx I think it's a TEDx talk out of him. And so that's his living. He goes around and speaks, does corporate events. And his sort of niche is he speaks in English and French. So he does his presentations bilingually, which is great in Quebec. It's a needed thing in Quebec. And so he interviewed me for a book that he's writing. And we were talking about kind of like what we're talking about. And I learned so much. And so I was talking with him about the idea of like sending questions or not sending questions. And so he usually sends people, he's like, hey, looking forward to talk. It'll be great to dig into. Here are 3 quick things that maybe we should cover. And I still haven't started doing that. I know it's a good idea, but if people ask, just like you, if people ask, I do send kind of like, let's dig into your background. Maybe we can talk about teaching or this or that. But yeah, I try to keep it not. I don't get too in depth. How do you organize all this stuff? Do you like I know you and I use Evernote for the podcast, which thank you for doing that. I love Evernote. But like, how do you keep organized in terms of like getting the show out and research and anything like that? What do you use behind the scenes?
Well, so I'm still trying to figure out, I would like to get, like episodes on a release schedule, right now I'm doing 2 a month. So it'd be nice to do like the second and fourth Wednesday or something, but I haven't quite been able to get kind of in the routine of that. So I really just, man, people in theater are so busy, especially like I've been wanting to get several stage managers, and those guys are impossible to nail down. And so I just get people when I can. And then, I usually try to edit them pretty quickly after I interview them. Just because it's fresh in my mind, and I'm kind of in that space of podcasting, and so I usually try to do that within. And I'm in a really weird situation now where I have a lot of time, and so I have time to sit down and edit things really quickly after an interview.
That's great. That's a good setup. Yeah.
On like Facebook Messenger to reach out with people if I don't have their email, and then I try to do most things by email, and then just like writing things down. Like Google Calendar I use, and pretty low tech right now.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's interesting to think about the setup for, like, I'm so glad I started using Evernote way back in 2000. I think I started using it in 2008 maybe, or 2009, like right when it came out. And I've got all this great gold from like a decade of doing this stuff. So I don't know what to do with it, but I have like all these interesting things people have sent me, and it's all just in this like giant Evernote Contrabass Conversations published, notebook with like, well over 1,000 individual pieces of this and that. And I'm just always thinking about the systems. I use Google Calendar too. And that helps me to sort of map out, because for my podcast, I'm always trying to stay ahead, because I don't want to, because I quit doing it for 5 years because I got overwhelmed with other projects. So I've just tried to like, and that Google Calendar is great because it got just podcast release. And when I talk to somebody, I can say, all right, we're going to get you out about here and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Especially with your setup, like doing 2 episodes a week, like, yeah, you've got to have some intense organization. But for me right now, I don't really have too much of a system going, because it's pretty, 2 a month is pretty manageable.
That's a nice amount for the rhythm. There's a podcast I listen to called the Per Service Podcast, and they do every other week, just like that. Or Libsyn, and I know you're using Libsyn, which I love. It's great for hosting. They have their podcast about podcasting, which is incredibly geeky, called The Feed. And I listened to, I actually was just listening to The Feed today. But yeah, every other week is like a really nice amount. Like, nobody should do 2 a week. It's insane to do that. It's just with the pace of events that I find myself at, it seems like if I don't do that, then when things like ISB or Base Europe happen, I'll tell people, all right, well, we'll put this out in like 7 months, but yeah, it's probably someday maybe a little downshift to 1 a week. I think I like the 1 a week, but I think whatever can be sustainable is the sweet spot. And everybody has seasons of their life where then they get busier, and if you're a bi-weekly that's a beautiful setup.
Yeah, especially when you're just getting started, just so you can kind of like give yourself some padding and some buffer in case something weird happens with editing, or you can't get a hold of someone, or it's nice to I wanted it to very much stay kind of like a side hobby, so I didn't want it to be something stressful or something that kind of added to life busyness. I just wanted it to be something to help me grow, and so that's my solution to that problem, is to do 2 a month.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a great, and yeah, the beautiful thing about anything like a podcast or anything is like the momentum that builds over time. Like, I remember like I did 2 podcasts that were just me, and then, or 3, I think, early on. And then I thought, I got to get somebody on this show. Cause I was like literally talking about my podcast gear. I think on one of those first ones, I was like, I'm speaking into this microphone. I think like, this is the most boring thing anybody could do. And so then one of my good friends, like you were talking about, people that you're actually working with, I think my first few guests were all people I just knew in my circle. And I had this one wonderful soul, totally great. He's like the king of chaos. He's this guy named John Grillo and he had so many connections. So the only reason why I had well-known people in the bass world on at first was because John, like I didn't know any of these people, but John knew him from Tanglewood or New World Symphony or whatever. So John was sort of and then at a certain point, it's like, oh, I can say I've had blah, 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 blah. And then people are like, oh, I want to do that. That's the thing with so-and-so and such and such. So it's fun. It's fun. You never know where something's going to go, when you start it. But
yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think one of the big things I learned from Robert was like, just start something. Mm-hmm. I asked him one time in one of my lessons, every time I go into a lesson, he had some cool project he was working on. And so, while you're unpacking your instrument, he's talking about an album or that he's working on or whatnot. And so I asked him one time, I said, Robert, how much of what you're doing is initiated by you and how much is it of people calling you? And I would have thought since he's pretty well established, he's been around for decades doing this, that it would have been, mostly people asking him to play. But he was like, 75% of what I do comes from my own hustling. And that like blew my mind. And so I was like, okay, if Robert still has to hustle, I need to start doing something. I need to start a podcast or concerts or, I think you just have to start something in this day and age. And you've talked about this a lot, like entrepreneurship and just taking initiative and not just always waiting around for a spot to open up or a gig to come along, but starting something.
Yeah, and Robert's a great example of that, and I can't say enough good things about Robert. Robert will be on this podcast. We've been talking about. We've just been trying to find. I would love to spend some time with him in person, and I know I'm going to be on the East Coast at some point this fall. So I'm trying to coordinate something, just because like I did this. Mark Dresser over here on the West Coast was somebody I'd wanted to have on for years and years, and finally I was like, all right, I'm going to be in San Diego. Boom. We're going to hang out and talk. And it was perfect because I got to not only talk with him, but I got to watch him teach, go through some scores and play on some different instruments and tunings. And I don't know if that helped the podcast, but it was a lot of fun for me. So I want to do the same thing with Robert and some other like people that should have been on like a long time ago. But, well, and I can't thank you enough for helping out with Contrabass Conversations. I'll obviously talk about it before we roll, but Krista has gone. It's embarrassing how much you've probably heard me yammer on about this and that. So Krista's helped to catalog and categorize everything that's happened on the show. What we'll do with that, I do have some ideas, and I definitely would love to get you on board with that. Some sort of book learned from all these people is definitely in the future. The pace of Jason Heath life right now is too busy to think about like what that might look like, but I'm not going to be doing 5 hours of middle school subbing after this spring. So I'll have a little more time to think about that. And so that everybody should follow along with this podcast. It's super cool. If people have what happens for me these days, and I'm sure it is happening or will continue to happen, but a lot of people suggest, hey, you should talk to X, you should talk to Y, you should talk to Z. Do you have I think you have contact info on that website, right? Do you have Backstage Creative? Are you using the Libsyn website? Is that where you're sending people?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll link up to that. I think it's the backstagecreative.libsyn.com or something like that.
Something, yeah.
But if they want to reach out to you, they can email you through that, I think, or contact you somehow.
Yeah, you can email me at kakopper1@gmail, kakopper1@gmail. That's probably the best way to reach out.
Okay, I'll link up because you never know who's listening. Well, Tom Mendel, who I was talking about, the Hamilton bassist, he's listening. I know Derek Jones listens, and I'll bet a lot of other people in that situation might be like, oh, you should talk to this stage manager, I'll make an introduction. And so thank you for doing the podcast. And certainly the help that you bring to Contrabass Conversations, which I seriously do think. I think it would have seemed crazy to quit, but I think I was on the verge of just because I can be impulsive sometimes, and I was getting overwhelmed at the end of 2017, I think. And I thought, I can see the podcast like calling it quits, because I was just like, other projects were picking up, and I was seeing my time vanishing. So thank you for doing something that I tried to do for like a couple weeks, and it was like the worst experience of my life, because I had to listen to myself again. But so Krista has gone through and listened to hundreds of these episodes at this point. I don't even know how many hundreds, but it's like you've probably done over 400 of them at least, maybe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
I'd imagine.
So thank you so much. I owe you like 10,000 beers, and which we will have at some point. And but then also like we'll have a chance to work on this in some sort of project we can get out to the public for sure, in the future.
Awesome.
So. Krista, thanks for everything you do, including this new podcast. Folks, check out the Backstage Creative wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're listening, you must be using an app of some sort, unless you're using our Contrabass Conversations app. If that's the case, just go in the Contrabass Conversations app and click the link to take you to the Backstage Creative. Thank you so much to Krista, and thank you to everybody else on the Contrabass Conversations team. We're talking about Steve Hinchy, Michael Cooper, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And if you're looking for a bass or some bass lutherie of any sort, Mitch is located just east of Dallas, Texas, and he does great work. And we're going to have him on the podcast with some other young luthiers at the International Society of Bass Convention, which is coming up soon. And if you are at that event, come say hi. We're going to be set up at the D'Addario booth all week. We're going to be doing live interviews. We've got all sorts of cool guests scheduled. So thanks to the D'Addario team for setting that up. And you get to meet Trevor Jones, who's going to be there, who handles so much of the back stage, I guess, for lack of a better word, that's on my mind today. The back, behind the scenes elements of this podcast, and one heck of a bass player and a great guy too. So come say hi to me, come say hi to Trevor, and we will see you again, either here on the podcast or at ISB, regardless, soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.